doesn't it show us in the corner?
Yeah. All right, so it's just over 10 a.m. Brisbane time. Most of the registered attendees are here. I think we should get started. Firstly, welcome and thank you all for registering. I'm Carl Chua. I'm an engineer at the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. I work in the Freight and Supply Chain Productivity Division. I've been there for about 5 years, primarily doing notices, permits, vehicle safety assessments. This is the first session of mine, titled NHVR and Local Road Managers. During the session, feel free to submit questions. We'll try and consider them at the end of each section and also at the end of the presentation. If there's a question we can't answer, we'll get in touch with you directly, or we'll put it in the 9th session down the bottom there as part of the panel discussion. I'll pass you on to Kerry Platter here.
Yeah, I'm Kerry Platter. I'm the Principal Engineer with Freight and Supply Chain Productivity Division of NHVR. I've got about 40 years experience with engineering with local, state and federal governments and also private industry. About 30 years with heavy vehicles and heavy machinery. Been at the Regulator since 2013, so almost 8 years now. So what we'll do, we'll go on. The sessions we're going to run high-level information sessions, basically, because what we want to know is what you want to know. So a big part of the sessions will be the questions and answers, so we can tailor our discussions further on. So we might get into it.
Sure. So, next slide.
Just say we're actually recording these sessions and they'll be available through the NHVR YouTube.
Yeah, these sessions will be recorded and we'll be able to provide you the link or location so you can access them if you want to share them or
review.
Yeah. All right.
All right. So in the last 8 years with NHVR, I've had a fair few dealings with local road managers, and it's apparent there's not a clear understanding of our role. So the first part we'll go through is that. Like most local road managers, probably your interaction with the NHVR is either through the permit or notice consent process, through the portal, or maybe with our stakeholder engagement people. But we're a little bit more than that. We're not just seeking access to heavy vehicles. What are we? We're actually an independent statutory body corporate, which sounds fancy, but it basically means we've got a CEO who reports to a board, and then that board actually reports to the transport ministers in all the participating states, which are everyone except Northern Territory and Western Australia at the moment. Though we do deal with them in a lot of work that we do, because eventually the aim is to have a national law. What do? We administer the heavy vehicle national law. So we're not a jurisdiction. We don't have any jurisdictional powers like the states, and we're not a road manager, so we cannot make road manager decisions. So we administer the law. Okay. So heavy vehicle national law, enacted in February 2014 in the ACT, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria, and it's applicable to heavy vehicles greater than 4.5 tonne. So that's a motor vehicle with GVM or gross vehicle mass greater than 4.5, or a trailer with an ATM or aggregate trailer mass over 4.5, or a combination including at least one heavy vehicle. So we operate under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, HVNL, and the current regulations under that fatigue management, a general regulation mass dimensional loading regulations, and vehicle standards. Now, while the Heavy Vehicle National Law was introduced in 2014, most of the requirements in the law are based on national legislation that was adopted by the jurisdictions in the mid-1990s. So the actual law itself and the main parts it includes are not new. They've been around for 25 years, but it's mainly been the jurisdictions and the states that have been dealing with it directly. It also doesn't cover light vehicles, so light vehicles are still covered by state law, you'll put it that way. All right. What's new in the heavy vehicle law? Well, the heavy vehicle law actually defines a road manager role. So what a road manager is and what they're required to do. And local road managers are included. So previously with the state laws, in most of the jurisdictions, the states couldn't, the states may or may not have consulted with local authorities or local road managers before they allowed vehicles on the road. But in the Heavy Vehicle National Law, local road managers are recognised as road managers and responsible for to manage heavy vehicle access to their infrastructure. Now, that's brought about a lot of additional issues, if you want to put it that way. Lack of resources being the main one, and lack of knowledge probably being the second one, or lack of understanding. So that's part of what we do. In the National Heavy Vehicle National Law, it also looked at road managers actually assessing public safety, infrastructure and public amenity risks as part of allowing heavy vehicles on the road. It allows for risk mitigation through application of conditions, but there's also a requirement to justify any decisions. So justify the conditions you put on and why they're being put on and what risks they're mitigating, and also if consent isn't given, there's justification of why that consent wasn't given against the risks and how they can be mitigated through conditions. It also has some time frames on responses, and it's 28 days. Part of that is because previously it was industry looking at some sort of time frame. Previously I've heard of cases where there's been double application and no response in 7 years, so they wanted a bit more certainty they're actually going to get a response. And part of that is also a decision review process where decisions can be reviewed either internally with regard to road managers or externally with regard to the NHVR. And there's also a provision for jurisdictions to override decisions when it's seen to be in the best interest of the jurisdiction. But that's only been used once as far as I know. So next. The interesting thing about the Heavy Vehicle National Law, it's actually got a set of objectives at the start of the Heavy Vehicle National Law. And it says the objective of the Heavy Vehicle National Law is facilitating and regulating the use of heavy vehicles in road in a way that promotes public safety and manages the impact of heavy vehicles on the environment, road infrastructure and public amenity, and promotes industry productivity and efficiency in the road transport of goods and passengers by heavy vehicles, and encourages and promotes productive, efficient, innovative and safe business practices. So if you look at those objectives, they've all got an and, so they're all equally important. Local road managers play a major role in Part B, and they make sure the heavy vehicle regulator has a major part in A, so we're A and C. So we're interested in safety and productivity and helping the road managers to manage the impacts. So it all works in together. So the objectives of HVR are actually the objectives of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, and we're not, though it may seem different sometimes, we're not actually industry or road manager centric. Our job is facilitating heavy vehicle operations to meet the objectives of the HVNL. So what's our role? So we administer one set of heavy vehicle laws, promoting public safety, managing impact of heavy vehicles, promoting industry. So our role is to administer the law to achieve the objectives of the law. Next. Who are the NHVR, which is a bit different to what is the NHVR? I hope everyone can hear us clearly. If not, just send a comment through or a question through so we can. So we're based in Brisbane with a national focus. We're administrative officers in Adelaide, Brisbane, Canberra, Launceston and Melbourne, and some other compliance officers around the place. We carry out compliance activities in the ACT, South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria. And as we go on, you'll see we're going to eventually, all jurisdictions will have NHVR compliance officers. How are we organised? So we have approximately 400 staff at the moment. So we have the office of the CEO, which looks after the CEO and all things he does. And our CEO is Sal Petrosito. And there's 6 divisions. So there's corporate affairs, corporate services, operations, regulatory policy and standards, statutory compliance, and national services transition. What we might do is just go through and talk about the different divisions.
I'm sorry, Kerry, we've got a comment here saying sound is fading in and out. Maybe we should move a bit closer.
We'll move a bit closer and see how we go.
Thank you.
Is that better?
So, continue.
Continue, okay. So approximately 400 staff. We've got the office of the CEO. We went through that one. Next one. So our corporate affairs division looks after the interaction between the NHVR and outside, so it's things like social media. We've got a Facebook site, haven't we?
Yes.
Yes. I don't know, I'm a little bit old for all that stuff. All our digital stuff, our communications, our marketing, our relationship with other governmental departments, media design, and also employee engagement. Then we have our corporate services. So this is all the internal stuff, so looking after Carl and myself and the other 398 that work here. So it's digital solutions, finance, information, legal services, people and culture, performance, governance, risk, all, and procurement property, all the normal processes a business has. The operations size. So service delivery, they're probably the people you deal with the most. So their access, and they also look after the National Heavy Vehicle Accreditation Scheme, which has to do with mass management, maintenance management, fatigue management, and all the modules that go with that, which are all part of getting more compliance and better access to things. Southern region has to do with compliance. So it's actually those areas where we have compliance officers. So it's the sort of day-to-day running of those areas. Industry engagement and customer experience. They're your stakeholder engagement teams under John Gilbert's, and there's one of them basically for each service.
Yeah, I think we have a representative for each state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. There's also the call centre is under that.
Yep.
Hypercare, which looks after the
assisting operators. So the hypercare team assists operators how to lodge permits and use the portal.
okay, so it's portal
Yep.
use.
Yep.
And they also do the training of the operations officers. So they're ones in service with the access people.
Yep.
And National Compliance Services, they look after the on-road enforcement activities. So they're actually our compliance officers on the road. Regulatory policy and standards, that's where Carl and I live. So we're in freight and supply chain productivity. So what we're looking at, our job is to look at ways to enhance continuity of the supply chain, consistency of operation throughout all the jurisdictions, basically network access. We also do safety assessments on vehicles, but it's really looking at and productivity enhancements. So we're looking at the best way we can to help to get some consistency and continuity in the operation of vehicles. So there's lines on a map, such as borders, either between states or local authorities, don't mean a massive change in conditions of operation. So part of that, we actually do a lot of development of our area does a lot of development of the notices, so you may see some stuff from us. Regulatory standards and policy, they look after codes of practice and safety duties for operators. Regulatory standards, so the standards for the regulatory regulations and the regulatory model program. So we go to safety assurance and policy, they look after fatigue management. Back again.
Oh, sorry.
Fatigue management, safety assurance, which is part of the chain of responsibility, safety policy research, and also our internal workplace health and safety. And vehicle safety and performance, they look after vehicle standards, vehicle safety, and also that's where the performance-based standards team, which does the processing of the PBS, or they manage the PBS scheme.
Yep.
And do all that work before the vehicle gets to the road or before you get to see it. Statutory compliance, they're basically the ones who carry on. They do investigations over intelligence, which they share on vehicle operations and heavy vehicle operators, and they share that with the police and the jurisdictions. They look after prosecutions. They have a thing called proactive compliance, a team that does that, which is actually looking at trends in the heavy vehicle industry that may create risks that they get on top of as soon as they can. So they look at operators and other things like that and collect information to be able to do proactive compliance. So have a talk to operators before, or the industry before things go wrong. And the last team, is a national service transition. As we said before, we have compliance officers. This is the transitioning of the state compliance officers over to an NHVR role. And currently in New South Wales and Queensland, the state compliance officers are working under working for the NHVR under a agreement. So next thing is transition project. So we're looking at all the New South Wales compliance activities with NHVR by mid-2022. And in South Australia, phase 3 is the inspection services, so the vehicle inspection services. So they're looking at that by the end of 2022. And in Queensland, expecting to look at the transition starting early this year and ending late 2022 at this stage. So after that time, all the compliance activities will be directly managed by the NHVR, which yeah, it should be able to get rid of a lot of the inconsistency that industries experience in compliance,
Yep.
and also give the road managers a one-stop area where they can contact us if they have compliance issues.
So Kerry, in Queensland, the expected start for the transition is early 2021.
Yes.
And late 2022.
Yeah.
We just had a question from Bruce Duncan about that, but that's all good.
But that's the latest we've got on it.
Yeah.
But again, that all relies, that's the plan at the moment.
Yep. So late 2022.
Yeah. All right then. We can stop. Oh no, just one more slide. So what do? We do access management through the portal and through our access management team. Look after chain of responsibilities, fatigue management, electronic work diaries. We're at the forefront of approving and running through with those. We support local government and other local road managers and the jurisdictions as well. Mass intervention and loading is what we get involved. National Motor Vehicle Accreditation Scheme, performance-based standards, vehicle standards, and also we're running the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project, which some of you may have been involved in. So we've got a later session which will discuss that. I think session 5, I think.
Yeah. I'm getting a lot of really good questions here, but I think some of them will relate to some of the slides later down in the presentation.
Well, we want to have a bit of a break. We'll have a look at the questions now and see if we can answer those questions.
Yeah, I'll go from the bottom. So one of the first questions is from Martin. Where does the responsibility start and stop for the road manager in relation to accessing permits?
Accessing permits or consenting to permits?
Just see here, that's all we have in the question.
All right. Yeah, with the question itself, we maybe leave that one until later because we go on to talk about responsibilities and what the law requires you to do.
Yep.
So we'll leave that one for
That's
now.
fine. Let me just browse through here. A lot of them are more, there's a fair few that are about permit and road manager roles.
Yeah,
I think we'll wait
them.
we'll wait for the end of the session to discuss those. Assessing permits.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind, we'll wait till the end. We still have a few more slides that may cover that.
Yep.
Did you want to just continue?
Yeah, we can continue on. Okay, so we're going on to access decisions and something that's known in the law as restricted access vehicles. Okay, so in the mass dimensional loading regulations, there's they set dimension of mass limits for vehicles. So a typical prime mover semi-trailer combination that you see running down the road. Steer axle 6.5 tonne, tandem drive with 4 tyres. So I hope you understand some of this terminology. So just normal prime mover semi, 16.5 tonne, triaxle group 20 tonne, total 43 tonne. If they've got a complying steer axle, or 42.5 tonne without a complying steer axle. So they're regulation limits. There's also limits on those vehicles to be no more than 2.5 metres wide, except for your mirrors and signalling devices, 4.3 metres high or 19 metres long. If I go outside those limits that are in the regulations, I become what's called a restricted access vehicle. And under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, they require a specific authority or an exemption to access the road network. And that's where road managers come into play. So there's basically 2 mechanisms for managing access. The first one is notices. So they're all applied to a category of a vehicle. And we've got some examples later, or permits, and they apply to specific vehicles or to so they can apply to a company and have vehicles owned by that company on there. So permits are for specific vehicles, and notices apply to a category of vehicle. So if we go over to the next page, and under the law, there's actually 3 classes of restricted access vehicles. There's class 1, which are basically oversized and overmass. The basic principle of these things is they're not built, or they're carrying a load that means they cannot comply with the regulation mass and dimension limits. So we have things like special purpose vehicles, and we'll have some examples further on, which are basically non-load carrying vehicles that, because of how their intended use, have to be heavy or wide. So we look at something like a crane. If a crane has to be heavy to enable it to lift things, otherwise it'll fall over every time it goes to lift something. So they have to have counterweights to that on. So next lot is OSM, or oversized, overmass, load-carrying vehicles, transporting individual loads. And then you have agricultural vehicles and implements. And most of the rules for these ones, again, are based back to the mid-90s with some national regulations, but we'll go into that in a later session. Class 2 is high productivity vehicles, so you get your performance-based standards, or your PBS vehicles, B doubles, B triples, road trains, controlled access buses, because they can carry more people, so they're high productivity. But they exceed regulation, overhang, and other dimensions, length dimensions, so they're restricted access vehicles. The other ones, combination vehicles, are basically conforming vehicles that, because of the way they're combined, means they don't comply with the regulations. So B doubles, 2 trailers, and it's over 19 metres long, therefore it's a class 2 vehicle. Class 3 is, basically I like to say, it's none of the above. And a lot of them have got to do with mass, though some have got to do with dimensions as well. So there's a 50-tonne truck and dog notice that allows them to operate over 42.5 tonne. There's a carriage of spreader boxes on the back of tippers and that allows them to travel between work sites, things like that. Freight schemes, import-export schemes, commodity transport, grain harvest management schemes, cartage of baled commodities like hay. So we'll see a few examples of those. So they don't fit in the other 2 classes, they become a class 3.
So we do have some resources available that illustrate in the form of a chart. It sort of splits up what's class 1, class 2, and class 3. There are examples of vehicles that are on there. I'll be able to share that document to you all after the presentation.
Yep.
That's all right.
Yep.
So next one, Gary.
Okay, next one. Okay, so what we've got there is just what a notice looks like, or a Gazette. It's called a Gazette notice because it's published in the government Gazette. It's Commonwealth Australia, and it's a notice. And that one's a national class 2 B double authorisation notice. So B double is defined in the regulations or in the law as a prime moving towing 2 trailers, where the second trailer sits on the back of the first trailer, and there's some limits on how long it can be. But so it's complying B double under the law, but to get access to the road, it's got to run under a notice because it can't have general access because it's not a regulation vehicle. So a notice is a legal instrument and allows us to issue authorised exemptions to a heavy vehicle class. In this case, it's a B double. Generally, they have conditions or reduced needs for permits, because it's like if I comply with the requirements of the notice, I can travel on the routes that are approved under that notice. So there's a Class 2 B double notice, there's a Class 1 road train notice, Class 1 SPV notice, Class 1 agricultural notices, but they cover a group of vehicles to allow, because otherwise you'd be issuing thousands and thousands of permits.
There are also state-based notices, which cover a variety of different exemptions that were brought over from the previous law. A lot of these can be found on our website. Some of them are tricky to read, so if you do come across one that doesn't really make sense, feel free to contact us. We are always trying to consolidate them and turn them into national notices, but it's sort of an ongoing process.
Yeah, it takes a little while because unlike previously when the states issued notices under their old laws, there was no requirement to get consent from all road managers. However, if we go out for, say, a B double notice, we're looking at consent from all road managers, or we'll seek consent from all road managers, and I think we're close to 500 road managers we deal with. So, but at least you'll have a say in what's going on.
Yep. Do you want to move on to permits?
Yeah, we did the next one. You can do that. You want me to do it?
So permits, pretty much, permit is needed. So if I'm an operator and I'm running under, let's just say, the B double notice, which was mentioned before, the B double notice authorises a network, so a B double network. And if I'm an operator and the road that I want to go to isn't on that network, the general principle is I need a permit. There are other cases if you're a different class of vehicle, such as maybe a Class 3 vehicle, where you sort of fit outside of the box. There's no notice that suits your need. You just have to apply for a permit as an operator. So permits can be applied through via the NHVR portal. What we do when we get that request from the operator is we identify where they want to go, what the vehicle looks like, and we'll seek consent to whoever owns that specific road on their application. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of permits?
Yeah, permits and notices are preferred to permits, and if we go, we'll have a talk about the ministerial guidelines later, which
there's a bit more information later. We'll talk about the permit process and consent and all that a bit later.
But
I think we should probably go to the next one to look at some individuals of the vehicles.
Maybe if we just look at that permit there, it says that one's for a B double, company name, address, B double up to 25 metres is it's in the period issues, and then the cap routes and approved on it. Permits can be issued for a maximum of three years. We notices have a maximum life of 5 years, so that's another difference. So, but we'll only go for 3 years if we get approval from all the road managers for a permit. Okay. So we'll look at some examples of restricted access vehicles. So the first one is special purpose vehicles. So the general principle is they're not designed to carry a load and are the size they are because they need to be that size to do the job that they're doing. So a fire truck, they're actually allowed to carry some water and foam, but I'd be a bit worried if a fire truck got to, especially that looks like an airport, that firefighting one, come to get a burning plane and wasn't allowed to carry foam in it and got there and just sat and watched the plane burn to the ground. So that's why they're allowed some extra equipment on them. Extra carriage, so they're a special purpose vehicle. They're built for a purpose other than carrying a load, except for the load that's required for them to perform the task they're performing. The yellow one, top right, is a concrete pumping unit. Again, they need to be heavy or exceed regulation masses. Normally they're not exceed regulation dimensions. Rear overhang they may exceed. So, because to get the boom length to be able to pour concrete at the top of a 10-story building or wherever they're pouring it, or if they're reaching right across to a massive big area. You know, they've got some really big ones that are pouring the bases for the wind farms. So they have to be on the outside of this big hole, so they might have to reach 15, 20 metres in to be able to pour the concrete where it's needed. So, which makes them heavy, and therefore they're allowed to go, but don't carry load. They can actually carry some water. The main reason they're allowed to carry some water and some pipe stems, and that is, if they don't carry water, they can't clean out the piping, and so they're a single-use item if they're that. So there's a concession for them to carry water to be able to clean out the pipes after they use them, so that they're not a solid block of concrete after every use. One on the left is a grader. Now, bottom left is grader. The interesting thing is these may or may not be, they're a special purpose vehicle, but they're not a special purpose vehicle under the heavy vehicle, National Heavy Vehicle Law, if they don't exceed mass and dimension requirements. Some of your smaller graders may be regulation, may meet the requirements for regulation vehicles, not be restricted access vehicles under law. But your bigger graders, they're usually heavier on the rear axles than they're allowed to be, and longer than the requirements of the law, so they become special purpose vehicles. So a vehicle can be a special purpose vehicle, but it may not be a Class 1 restricted access vehicle under the law. They have to exceed regulation requirements. Okay, the next one is a crane. In this case, it's what we call a pick and carry crane, and obviously that particular one's probably running 12-ton an axle, where the regulation is 9-ton an axle. But it is not heavy, and it's not heavy at the rear particularly. It can't lift anything. So that's why special purpose vehicles are there. A requirement. Yeah, that's why we allow them access to the road. Next.
So they're SPVs. We go down.
The next thing we've got oversized, overmass load carrying vehicles. And the basic principle here is indivisible loading. So if you have a look at the top left, it's a side hut or something like that, just on a normal tilt tray. It's over 2.5 metres wide. It's an oversized Class 1 restricted access vehicle. So there's conditions on those. It's got to have flags, signs, depending on the size, and other requirements, flashing lights, all that sort of stuff. So they're the conditions that are actually in the law to mitigate the risks. The next one is a prime mover, which is called a spread quad. So it's 4 axles with 4 tyres on each one on the trailer, with a gap between them to spread the load over the pavement and over bridges. So under the notice, that it gets 6.5 tonne on the steer, 18.5 tonne on the drive, and 35 tonne on the quad axle group at the back, with a total of 60 tonne with the 6.5. So it's carrying an indivisible item, which is that over end loader on the back of it, and it looks legit. So it's oversized, over mass. It's probably over 19 metres long, so it's a Class 1 restricted access vehicle, most load carrying. The one in the bottom left is another end loader by the looks of it, but a slightly bigger one. Now it's so big that they have to remove the tyres off it and remove the bucket off it to allow it to be transported on the road. With the tyres on, they're far too high, you basically can't get under any bridges. But if you have a look at that, it's got a prime mover at the front, and then it's got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 7-row platform trailer carrying the load. So they've got 8 tyres and axle. So the idea with a lot of this oversized, overmass load carrying, the heavier the load, the more tyres, more axles you put underneath it, so that your impacts on the infrastructure are controlled. So
there's two examples at the bottom there, generally larger, oversized or overmass movements. Most cases they're not covered by a notice and are usually treated on a case-by-case basis, route specific. The one in the top right that Kerry was talking about before, so you have a prime mover spread quad, which is just that trailer. The quad, spread quad is just another way of describing how the axle group is set up. This vehicle is covered under one of the national Class 1 notices.
or two.
Or two. But yeah, it's probably because it's not as wide and maybe not as heavy as the examples at the bottom.
When we talk about the two notices, there's actually a notice for dimension and there's a notice for mass. And there's a reason for that in that a person, operator could be operating within the requirements of the mass notice, but be outside the dimension notice, and instead of applying for a permit for mass and dimension, they'll have only applied for a permit for the dimensions.
There are a lot of quick questions here, but one is specifically about the mass you get on the quad, on the split quad in this top right-hand example. Under the notice, it can range. It goes up to
4 tied axles. 4 tied axles is 35 tonne, and with 8 tied axles, it can be anything up to 57.5 tonne. But those masses actually come from work that was done in the late 70s, early 80s, and they've been carried over until now and allowed basically notice access since at least the mid-1990s. So it's just local road managers might have known about it.
So just to quickly clarify, this example in the top right, I'd say it's quite common with the notice. The steer axle, you usually get around 6.5 tonne. The drive, you'll get about 18.5 tonne. And then on the quad axle group at the rear, it ranges between 35 to 57, depending on how many tyres you have on each axle.
And how wide.
So there'll be terminology like for 4 tired axles or 8 tired axles. It just depends how many you have on the axle group, and that is covered under notice on the network.
And we'll talk about ground contact width of the axle group. So
they
actually, the 8 tied ones will actually widen out.
So there's the notice is quite. There are more conditions that relate to ground contact width. So usually, what that means is how wide it's spread out. It depends on how much more mass. But we do have I think the 3rd or 4th session goes into Class 1 OSIN vehicles specifically. We'll be able to get into all those specifications and answer all the questions when we get there.
The one down the bottom right is a dump truck body for the mines. Probably sits a little bit wide, so it has pilot and escorts and have police and everything on that sort of load. So they're the sort of conditions that are used to mitigate the risk of these things.
So I think we'll go on to Class 2 now, because it's still another Class 2. Well, actually, we'll finish Class 1. So another
we've got plenty of time.
Another part of Class 1 is agricultural vehicles and implements. The majority of these vehicles run under the national Class 1 agricultural notice, which exempts them, which allows them to run at different widths, different dimensions and mass in particular zones across the country. Did you want to go through what these vehicles are?
Well, basically on the top left, it's an agricultural combination. So it's a tractor, which is an agricultural machine, towing an agricultural implement, which in this case I think it's a baler. If I made some new country or road managers may be able to help us with that, but I think it's a baler. The one in the middle at the top, that's just a harvester. So it's an agricultural machine. And then you've got an auger, so it's an agricultural implement, not an agricultural trailer. A grape harvester, agricultural machine, ploughs, agricultural implements, and the last one down the bottom is an agricultural trailer. Now, an agricultural trailer is defined as able to carry a load, designed to carry a load, and used exclusively for agricultural purposes. So that's just a thing on agricultural trailer. And every agricultural trailer is a Class 1 restricted access vehicle, whether it exceeds mass and dimension or not. That's just a thing in the law. And when you tow off a tractor, it becomes any of those with an implement or a trailer. With a tractor, it becomes an agricultural combination. Now, there's an agricultural notice that's just been redone.
Yes, we released a national notice, I think, maybe a year and a half ago. It pretty much covers the movement of the majority of these vehicles, depending on where you want to operate, or depending where operators want to operate. There's different zones, so the same conditions may not apply if you're coastal versus inland, yeah. Okay. Class 2.
Yeah, okay, Class 2.
Yeah, Class 2.
So, with Class 2, basically they're road trains and B doubles and controlled access buses. The way you actually work out what these are is you look at the way they're coupled together. And so if they've got a drawbar on them, that's an A-type coupling. And if they've got like a fifth wheel, which is what sits on the back of a prime mover, that's a B-type coupling. So we could look up top left, triple road train, type 2 road train, they're called, but the proper term for that is an A triple. It's got 1, 2, 3 trailers, that makes it a triple, and the couplings are drawbar couplings, and they're A couplings, so it's an A triple. The one on the top right has got 3 trailers, so it's a triple, but it's got B couplings, so it's a B triple. The one, the bottom left, it's again got 3 trailers. The first coupling is an A trailer, so it's got a dolly under the, and then it's got a B coupling, so it's an AB triple. So that's basically a prime mover with a semi-trailer with a dolly towing a B double trailer group, makes an AB triple. And the one on the bottom right is, you'll see quite common, 2 trailers, so it's a double, and it's got a B coupling, so that's a B double. So they're pretty easy once you work out what you're talking about.
There's similar to the different classes and vehicles. We do have another chart that illustrates most of these combinations, A, B doubles, or it'll show everything there. I can circulate that as well as the presentation slides and everything at the end.
Okay, and then we get on to performance-based standards, and we've got a full session on performance-based standards. I think it's the 3rd session.
Yeah, I think, yeah, 3rd session.
3rd session.
On PBS.
So you look at the first one, the top left, you think, oh, well, that's just a normal truck. It's actually in PBS because the rear overhang, which is the distance from the centre of the last 2 axles to the rear of the trailer, exceeds regulation dimension. So it's called into PBS. It's been assessed. It has the same or better swept path and tail swing and other performance than a vehicle that meets regulation requirements. And part of Australia Post putting that together, it allowed them to carry extra, they carry little bin things that they cart the mail around, and allow them to carry extra things in mail because they have a longer deck length.
So PBS is, they fit under a Class 2, the Class 2 heavy vehicle classification. What they are, in a short summary, is they're not a Class 2 vehicle that's off the shelf. They're sort of built to purpose and assessed on how they perform, and then they're matched to a network. That's sort of why they put in the Class 2. Yeah. And so they're more about, they're not really off the shelf, they're more there assessed. Yeah, so they're based on how they perform
rather than what they look like. So the second, so that'd be because it performs the same as a general access truck, it's a level 1 PBS vehicle. The top right is a PBS truck and dog, so it's a 3-axle truck towing a 5-axle dog trailer. So it ends up being a level 2A, so its performance is similar to a B double. And how it travels on the road and what it does. It turns better than a B double because it's got more articulation points, but there's other controls to stop it wobbling too much going down the road to comply with the standard. The one on the bottom left is getting very, very common. It's a PBS 2B A double. It's really a short road train. So same configuration as a A double road train, except shorter. The advantage of them is they can actually carry 4 20-foot containers or 2 40-foot containers, where the B double we looked at before can carry 2, possibly 3 20-footers. So that's a big difference, a productivity improvement. They run under notice in Queensland to come from Toowoomba to Port of Brisbane, and they also do a lot of container work there, especially. So it's opening up with those. Their performance as regards road space, braking ability, turning ability, everything is equivalent to a B double. The only issue they're a bit longer, so when you're doing route assessments, you've got to allow for the additional length for intersection clearance, time, stacking distances, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, they're really taking off. And the last one there is the most common PBS vehicle you'll see around. So it's a truck and dog, 3-axle truck, 4-axle dog trailer. Their performance is very similar to a general access vehicle, 20 metres long normally. So when they're loaded up to 50.5 tonne, they run level 1, so they have basically general access. If they can then load them up to 57.5 tonne and basically run on B double routes. But the only difference between the 50 tonne and the 57.5 tonne is their effects on structures and the way they perform in what I call, Lethbridge calls the dog evasion manoeuvre. So it's a manoeuvre where you hit the steering wheel and you come back, and it causes the tail of the trailer to wag out a bit. Usually further than what level 1 standards allow. So very good vehicles, very popular, very versatile. That's probably why they're being used so much.
Yeah, and that vehicle in the bottom right hand corner is covered by a notice as well.
Yeah. All right. So class 3s. We look at the class 3s. The last one we looked at was a PBS truck and dog. This one's a 50-tonne truck and dog and quad dog. They've been running under notice since well before the HPL came into existence. The reason they get 50 tonne, it's more than 42.5 tonne. So they've been, and that's why they run, but they don't have the performance controls that PBS does. So they've been running around on the roads for years, those things. The next one is on the top right, is a rigid truck carrying a harvester, towing a comb trailer with a comb on it. The reason these are class 3 because it's not indivisible loading, there's actually 2 loads on there, and they exceed width, so they exceed more than one dimension. So they're over width, over 2.5 metres wide, and they're over 19 metres long. So they're a class 3. Contract harvesting has been the driver for this, and both New South Wales and Victoria have a sort of pre-approved permit scheme to allow these, well, the jurisdictions allow them to run on their boats, with controls over, masses and sizes and conditions and all that sort of stuff. So they operate, but it supports contract harvesting, which is generally what we see all the time. Bottom left is a spreader box. So there is a multi-state spreader box notice, which I don't know if it applies to all participating bureaus, but allows you to keep the spreader box on when you're travelling between your stockpiles and your work sites, or your overnight accommodation, or your workshops, or your depots, just to save taking the spreader box off every time, because otherwise they're over length or over width and may exceed rear overhang. So they're a Class 3 vehicle. One on the bottom right. To efficiently load hay on a trailer, you exceed 2.5 metres wide, and because it's not that heavy, to get efficiencies of transport of hay, they do go to 4.6 metres high. So there's a number of different notices that we're looking to consolidate at the moment to cut baled economies, baled commodities like hay, with some national consistency. So they're your Class 3s. Any questions on those, Carl?
There's a few here. Just filter through. Not particular to the Class 3, but there are some questions. Did you want to answer some of them about general access? So one question is, can you clarify what vehicles are general access? So obviously no permit needed to go anywhere.
Vehicles that comply with the regulations, so a rigid vehicle up to 12.5 metres long, 2.5 wide, 4.3 high, an articulated vehicle like a truck and dog trailer or a prime mover semi-trailer, again 2.5 wide, 4.3 high, 19 metres long. They have to meet internal dimensions as well. So there's controls on rear overhang, axle spacing, axle masses are also controlled. So 6 tonne on a steer axle maximum, or 6.5 for the compliant steer axle. A single axle fitted with 4 tyres, which is most common, so your normal rigid truck, is 9 tonne, so 15 tonne total mass, with a tandem axle group 16.5 tonne, so with a 6.5 tonne steer you have a 23 tonne. A triaxle group gets 20 tonne with 4 tyres per axle, or 3 big tyres per axle, 3 wide tyres. And a quad axle group, or a group of 4 axles, gets 20 tonnes as well under the regulations. So if they meet the regulations, they're a compliant vehicle and they have general access, that is restricted by signed limits. So if you've got a mass limit on a bridge, that can restrict general access vehicles, or if you've got a dimension limit, or you've got a sign saying no, nothing heavier than 4.5 tonne down this road, they're all legal signs they have to comply with, but otherwise they're known as general access if they comply with the regulations.
I think I'll do, Kerry, when I circulate the slides, I might just add in one more slide just to summarise some of those general access mass and dimension limits. But generally, it's your rigid truck up to 12.5 metres long, and for your combinations, it's up to 19 metres long, 4.3 metres high, and 2.5 metres wide. But I'll add in some more information in some illustrations.
And there's a whole pile of internal dimensions. All right.
So I think there's only about 3 or 4 slides left.
Yep.
We want to just maybe finish those and answer all the questions at the end, because they're quite quite a variety, which is good. I'll go on to the next one.
So, under the National Heavy Vehicle Law, we're looking at access managers, what road managers, what their role is. So the role of the road manager is to assess the impacts of restricted access vehicles on public safety, infrastructure and public community. Use conditions to mitigate risk if they can, and to respond in a timely manner. So the resources, we've got the NHVR, including our website. You have ministerial conditions for granting access. The reason they're highlighted is because the law actually requires you to have consideration, and also requires us as National Heavy Vehicle Regulator to consider those in the approved guidelines. So there's standard conditions in the portal which can help you with your conditions and when to apply them. There's notices and pre-approvals. You may want to look at a notice to see what's allowed, or you might want to see what sort of conditions vehicles have and how they're managed. There's pre-approvals, which is a process that we introduce, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Around assessment guides, there's a number of them, but there's actually only one set of approved guidelines, which is the PBS, ministerially approved guidelines. And then you look at the state road manager policies on how they manage similar vehicles on their roads that interconnect with yours. So next. The Heavy Vehicle National Law requires consideration of approved guidelines by both the regulator and road managers. And it's actually, if you want to know, there's actually sections in the law that said that's what we require. So we might spend a little bit of time on this, and basically there's two approved guidelines. There's ministerial guidelines for granting access, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, and there's performance-based standard scheme network classification guidelines, and both these are available on our website. So when we look at the ministerial guidelines for granting access, it talks about roles and responsibilities of the regulator, road authorities, road managers, third-party entities, and all those sort of roles. Guiding principles for access decisions. This is, I'll go through the details of this. So some of the principles is to issue notices over period permits, over single trip permits. So the idea is to try to reduce the number of permits. So try to minimise the number of notices by grouping like things. At the moment, we look at bailed commodities, and we're looking to see if we can combine them all into one notice. At the moment, there's probably 7, 8, maybe 9 different bailed commodity permit schemes or notices that exist that we're trying to get into one that covers it all. So instead of people looking all over the place, make one place, one set of rules for moving things that have the same risk. So promoting vehicles that offer higher productivity is one of the guiding principles. The routes must be appropriate for the vehicle designing travel. So as heavy vehicle regulator, we're not telling you to put vehicles and routes that are appropriate, because that's your decision. Yeah. We can assist you in working out what's appropriate and what's not, but we can't make that decision for you. And next one's consideration of whole of route or whole of network benefits. So why there may be some issues with a certain part of a network or a link or something like that, that's where the whole of network benefits may come into play, and that's where road authorities may come into play as well.
Sorry, Karen, just to interrupt, one of the questions is, do we have a link to these ministerial guidelines for granting access? We'll be able to give you a copy and the link to it It's on our NHVR website, but I'll provide that at the end with everything else.
Yeah. Okay. So using template conditions, I noticed some permits. So part of the work with the portal was to set up those standard conditions. So because as part of going through all the conditions that have been put on permits, and there's a lot of different ways you can say the same thing. So we'll try to get them into a consistent conditions that the standard conditions are. And should have a proactive approach for managing assets. So there's some of the principles. The next section on guidance, significant risk to public safety. It talks about what is significant risk, what is public safety, national boundary vehicle regulator, road managers, use of crash history, and applicant compliance history. So there's some guidance on that. And then there's some guidance on efficiency and publicity, guidance on public amenity, which is basically looking at things like noise, emissions, traffic congestion and dust, and how providing access will affect those. And sometimes you can actually, if you have a higher productivity vehicle, it may be that it actually reduces your traffic congestion and your emissions because you're having less movements. So there's things like that. Talking about the different conditions, road and travel conditions, which are applied by the road manager, and it was National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. We actually do vehicle conditions which are specific to vehicles, which is the safe operation of the vehicles. So there's information on that. There's consultation with third party and different conditions going. How to use conditions to manage risk is another section in there, and giving some ways of doing it. And then some guidance on the process, and also some guidance on our assessments and the process. Now we're going to have some later section on assessment of vehicles, routes and structures. So they're later on in the piece, I think they're 5 and 6 and 7. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
So the main thing about the improved guidelines, you should all have a look at them because you've got to give them consideration. And that's actually written into the law, and we've got to give consideration to them as well. So, anything?
And, yeah, PPS vehicles also have their own network classification guideline,
Yeah.
which is also on the NHVR website.
Okay. This one, go back. Okay.
Back one?
Yeah, go back one. There's also approved guidelines that are approved. These are the ones that relate to access. We have approved guidelines for vehicle standards and fatigue and all the other things that we do. So there's also other guidelines apart from these ones that are approved, considered approved guidelines in the law that the regulator has to give consideration to. All right, next. Local road managers. So you're responsible for considering restricted access, vehicle access to non-state controlled roads. So generally includes local government, ports, airports, forestry and national parks, depending on agreements with jurisdictions and things like that. Generally excludes third parties and managers of private roads, mine access and haulage roads, railways and water infrastructure. Railways, they could have a interface agreements, and that may change whether they're considered road managers or not. So with regard to third parties, they're actually defined in the law, in the Heavy Vehicle National Law, and a third party is generally an entity that is required to be consulted by another law. For example, in Queensland, they have the Electrical Safety Act, which means if you're encroaching within a certain distance of power lines, you need to get approval from them. Now this becomes an issue where you've got especially in the mining areas where you've got a dump truck or something being high load and it's crossing railway lines with electrical infrastructure above it. So that's what a third party is. They're required by another law to get approval from those people.
There's a question here about that, Kerry. So for oversized vehicles, is the applicant responsible for checking that their vehicle will fit down the route? Example, power line heights, intersections and tight corners?
Under the mass and dimension regulations, there's a requirement if you're operating on a notice to make sure the route is suitable before you move. So you've got to do a pre, and it's talking about that you're not going to damage road infrastructure or hit overheating branches or anything like that. So you've got to scope the route before you travel, and you're actually in breach of the regulations if you don't. And we include similar conditions on the permits that we issue as well. So there's a requirement to actually scope the route, make sure it's suitable.
That's up to the operator.
The operator is the responsible of the operator. But as a road manager, if you're aware of some issues in some certain areas, like if you know there's overhanging trees, you might want to talk to the operator and say, look, do you realise this is there? That goes into the relationship with the operator, but there is a requirement for them to scope the route before they travel.
Yep.
Okay. And with these restricted access vehicles, the fact they've got a permit or a notice doesn't give them the power to ignore things like mass limit signs and dimensions limit signs. So, and if you want them to cross something that's mass limited, and it's mass limited under your powers as a road manager or under the laws you operate under, you have to give them exemption under that to allow them to do it. So that's a bit of just push them with a permit from us doesn't actually allow them to not comply with signage. And our permits can't, issued under our law, can't do that because it's not our law that the signs put up under.
Just a quick question here. So for private roads, who gives approvals as the road manager?
There's no requirement under the heavy vehicle national law to give approval for private roads.
So I believe when we seek consent for these permit applications and there is a private road, we will only seek consent to the gate.
Yeah.
To the gate or
because they're actually not recognised as roads. Roads under the heavy vehicle national law refers to public access roads, not private roads. So they're not a road, it's the same as you. And it's the same thing that applies to a lot of the laws with vehicles and that. Once you're on private property, you're on private property.
The presentation, I think the stream is frozen. Just refresh it. I think we should be fine. Let me just quickly refresh. Okay, no, it's back up now.
So you can get the last answer?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so do you want to move on to consent?
We'll go with consent.
Consent requests?
So as a road manager, you'll receive consent requests for either permits or notices or gazettes for operation of restricted access vehicles on your roads. So if you get a permit or a consent request for a permit, you have a couple of options. You can decide, yeah, I'm happy with those vehicles operating on that road. I'll add it to the notice network if there is one. So you might want to add a road to an industrial area to the B double notice, so you can do that. You can provide what we call pre-approval, which is where you say, look, I'm happy for vehicles similar to this, or with the same impacts as this vehicle or less, to access that area. I'm not quite prepared to go move to the notice shed, or there isn't a notice there. There may be a heavy haulage operator carrying ocean loads, has got a depot. The notice, class 1 notice, doesn't cover his platforms, but you know there's no issues with him using that. You might provide a pre-approval. What will happen then is, if he applies for access to that road for that vehicle, or they apply for access to the road with that vehicle, we automatically say, as a road manager, you'll approve that, and we'll issue the permit. The advantage of pre-approvals is they're very easy to change or withdraw or do whatever you want with and modify, and you can set them for every time limit you want. So we had a case early on where there was an industrial area which was being changed over to a housing estate. You want to put that? There was, I think, one business running B doubles down there. So they just gave pre-approval for 12 months until that the business finished. That was it. So they didn't actually have to issue permits all the time for it. So they just did pre-approval. Or you can just provide consent for that one permit application. And it may be because it's a one-off movement that's never going to happen again, so you're quite happy to do that. Or it may be quite onerous, if I want to put that way, and you've got to put special conditions in it. The idea with conditions, use them to mitigate risks. So you can basically provide those consents with conditions, mitigate risk, or without conditions if there's no concerns. And if you refuse, you need to provide justification for refusal. And you also got to have available documentation for refusals as well sometimes.
Just on that, Terry, question here. Is there a documented process to remove roads from the Gazetted network or pre-approved routes?
Pre-approved routes, if you've got a pre-approval with us, it's quite easy. We just say we want to remove them. With removal of routes from Gazetted networks, you put an application to have it removed. There's then a process in the law where I think they've got to give 30 days notice.
30 days notice.
30 days notice, which they've got to publish so that people can see it, so operators can raise objections or something like that. If it's resolved that the road can be removed,
yep.
After 30 days, it'll actually get removed.
So for the Gazetted networks, I'm pretty sure we have a form that has to be filled out and submitted. For pre-approved routes, I'm not too sure if there's a form at the moment. Or...
No, I think it's just it can be anyway.
Yeah, if you have the previous pre-approved approval, just forward it on it. Say you want to remove it.
Remove it, or you may want to modify it, so you can do a modified one and remove something else if you want to. We'll just keep it going. So so there is a process, a documented process for, or documented in the law, a process for removal of Gazetted routes. And again, you've got to, if someone questions it or raises objections, you've got to be able to justify why you're doing it.
Yeah. There's another question. Is there a list or database of all active pre-approved routes? Is this going to be placed on the NHVR website or portal?
Where? we've got a listing at the moment. They're in the process of trying to move it out to a
It's a map.
map on the portal.
Yeah, so when you're using the NHVR portal, there should be a layer, I think, in the route planner.
Yeah, well,
But it's still in the works.
it's still in the works, and we've got over 2,000 pre-approvals at the moment, so and for all sorts of vehicles, so it's interesting.
But we definitely are going to that.
Yeah.
So that's space.
Yep.
Um,
We can give some timing on that. We're going to find out
yeah,
a bit more information if you want to put that down, Cut.
Yep. Just while I'm noting that down, another question here, Kerry. Sometimes there is a more feasible logical route than a default route for Journey Planner. If the road manager suggests a more feasible route impacting another road manager, is the customer required to resubmit the application and amend the route?
I'm not sure of the
Yeah.
process is by access, but I think it could be because you can't actually, once you change, put another road manager on there, it's the way they've set up the system to work.
Yeah, we'd have to triple check that, but from my understanding, I think that would just go back to the case officer to determine if it's a new application or they would just amend the route.
I think it's actually a review application.
Yeah, it might be.
But that's their policy and processes, so.
We'll find it out for you.
Okay. So I suppose that's the permit side of things. With notices, you can consent with conditions or refuse with justification. And we will cover some vehicle route structural assessment in later sessions. Again, fairly high level general principles to deal with. So, where you right, Cole?
Yeah, you want to go to the next?
The next is the end, isn't it?
It's sort of the end now. There's quite a large number of questions. We'll probably go through them all.
Yeah,
we answer them. The next session is in 2 weeks' time. It's about the application of the bridge formula, which is in the mass dimension and loading regulation. And it's just a general overview of how that works, what it means. I think we go into mass exceptions, so like your CML and HML, what those mean, and also your compliance to your actual mass limit, which is that 6.5 ton on the steer. You might hear it from time to time. I'll go through the questions now. There is quite a lot here. Just see here. So one here, Terry. So does that mean if I approve a permit, then am I automatically giving the applicant an exemption for travel?
The permit is the exemption. But it's an exemption not for travel, it's an exemption from the requirements of the mass dimension and loading regs.
Okay. Other one here, yeah, we will be circulating all the information in this PowerPoint. Do you have any resources for increasing public knowledge on general access heavy vehicles? Most of our customer calls are about truck and dog combinations, which are already general access. I think we would have some publications. There are a few.
Yeah, there's some truck and dogs, yeah.
I think I'll put together that slide for the purpose of this presentation, and I'll find what we have that's already out there, sort of put it under a general access vehicle category. I think on our truck charts, there is a section at the top that says general access, and then the mass and dimension limits on that chart reflect the 19 meters, the 42.5 ton. But I'll put it all together and send it all out. If there are any more questions, just let me know. Another one here is we have a lot of double configurations working under the GML network, only displaying long vehicle signage. Is this legal, or should they still be displaying road train? So I think, was it last year or earlier last year, the sign requirements in the vehicle standards regulation got streamlined?
they're not legal standards, I don't think. MDL.
MDL.
We can find out the
Find
requirements.
it here, but I believe I've got it here. So between 22 to 30 metres long, it's just a long vehicle sign, and if you're over 30 metres, it's a road train. I'll send out this vehicle warning sign bulletin for your information as well.
And I think there's how many signs you
Yeah.
get over 22 you need on both ends, do you? Or, so this is actually Schedule 8 of the mass insulating rigs.
I think this is general vehicle standards, but we'll look into it and get the exact answer there.
Yeah.
So I do know they did some work to make it less
complicated.
There's only 2 options, yeah.
And some of the jurisdictional or the state notices that transitioned over were not compliant with the law on signage, so we had to change them over as well. Which, yeah.
Yep. Let me just see here. There's a few more questions. As a road manager, do we need to sign our roads up to the notices?
You'll be asked to be given consent unless consent is already given. We may have some things like the B double networks and that. They were transitioned over because they're already approved networks, based on the principle that when they will develop, that road manager or local road manager consent was given at that time.
So most cases,
historical networks, but any new networks or any new notices we won't transition. We have to go and get consent off you for them.
So if we're developing a new notice or trying to harmonise mass and dimension requirements across states, we generally let the road manager know what we're doing, and there'll be a formal consent request that includes what the vehicles are, what's happening really, and pretty much what the size of the vehicle and what network we're asking.
Yeah, so we're being a bit more proactive with the notices rather than just having them rock up and say we want consent for this. So we changed the way we're doing that.
Another question here is, can the agricultural trailer carry a load on a road or only on site? Example, empty when being moved from site to site.
Okay. The heavy vehicle national law only applies on the road. So they can do whatever they want running around in the paddocks, everything else, but they have to comply with the notice. And it doesn't stop them having an empty trailer or even a loaded trailer, as long as they comply with the mass dimension requirements in the notice, or they have a permit to do what they want to do.
So I believe the national agricultural notice is up to 45 tonne with various conditions. So I mean, if there was an agricultural combination loaded up to that, they could technically run under the network or zone that notice provides for.
As long as they comply with the notice.
Yep. Will there be another session to give more information on pilot and escort vehicles? I think in the Class 1 OSIN session, session 4, we may be able to speak about that.
We can probably add it in.
Yeah.
We haven't considered it, but we'll see if we can add a bit in on pilot and escorts. Again, pilot and escorts basically have been unchanged since the model OSIM regulations or oversized over mass vehicle regulations were introduced in the 1995 originally. So again, that's been long-standing. There's a review of pilot and escort operations and also licensing of pilot and escort vehicles, because there's no consistency in that as well, which is a result of having individual jurisdictions managing their own affairs. So
yeah, I think we can find out what's going on with the review and maybe put it into the OSIM session.
Yeah. We'll put it in the ASM session, we'll put a bit on private escorts in there.
Does the road manager have to condition for items for conditional registration, or does the state, for example, Queen TMR, impose those conditions?
With conditional registration, and just be aware that conditional registrations in different states mean different things. But in Queensland, the conditional registration system, they have the vehicles that you're going to use, and they'll have the conditions. So conditions, a lot of those are vehicle status conditions about exempting from lights and things like that. But their condition may say you need a permit or you need an exemption to allow. That's where you get involved. You won't be actually conditioning the vehicle, you'll be conditioning the access for that vehicle, if you understand that. So your conditions will be part of a consent that you've been asking for that vehicle.
How are the Gazetted networks updated?
Okay.
For example, the B-double network.
At the moment, the Gazette networks are all held by the individual states or jurisdictions, and we reflect that on our journey planner. In the future, they will be, well, the future plan is for us to hold the data, and so we update it for them. What happens if you want to update a Gazette route or a network? You can advise us. We've actually got a form that you fill in for network
So
upgrades.
I think it's, yeah, it could even be the same form as removing, adding.
So what you do, we will then process this, we'll check, we'll actually come back and say, are you sure that you want to do that? Well, yeah.
Yeah, I think in most cases that will get referred to whichever state runs the network. And
We'll send it to jurisdiction, and they will then update their maps, which are held on their individual websites, and then we'll reflect it once it's updated. Depending on the jurisdiction, it could be a couple of days, it could be a couple of weeks on those updates, but that's the process at the moment.
Is there a consolidated, updated register of notices? When searching for a notice on Google, it appears that multiple versions are available. I can answer that. The NHVR website generally has the most up-to-date list of notices on our notices page, but if you go to the source of truth, would be I think it's the federal legislation website, and it's if you do a search on there, you can sort of find which is the latest, what has been superseded. But generally, our notice page on the NHVR website should be updated, should be up to date.
And also on our notice page, it's got a list of transition notices. So
yeah, so
what happened because notices have a life of 2 or 5 years, all the state notices that were transitioned, so they were just carried over whole as bowlers as if they were made under the Heavy Vehicle National Law. In 2014, they come across and they had a 5-year life. So any of those that were still outstanding, and there was 70 or 80 of them, wasn't there, something like that? They were then transitioned, or then rolled over into proper NHVR, National Heavy Vehicle Law notices.
Next one, how can a twin steer truck and dog combination get to 50 tonnes in Victoria for general access?
Okay. They either go through PBS, or it depends on what the 50-tonne truck and dog notice in section in Victoria allows, whether they allow twin steers.
Yeah, but we can check.
We can check.
It varies on the length as well, if it's 19 or 20 through PBS.
Well, you have a twin steer, it just means you need to have less space on the upper axles.
I'll triple check that one.
Triple check that. The thing is, it's whether a twin steer is covered by the old 50-tonne truck and dog notices in Queensland, in Victoria. So if it's not covered by that, it'd be permits, or go through the PBS scheme and it'd be level 1 and up to 50.5.
Just a few more. Thanks for the questions. There's a lot here. Really good. What levels of compliance are being employed on the national network? I would assume the general road network.
No, with compliance, as we said, we're moving over to the NHVR compliance in all jurisdictions. It's probably a different focus, and we're looking at targeted enforcement, as we talked about, proactive compliance, so stopping the behaviour before it starts, if we see signs of it, and actually doing a lot of targeted enforcement. There's a lot more cameras. There's even talks of having drones running around enforcing, but the idea is to let the good operators do their job properly and focus on the ones who maybe don't do their job. I know myself, I used to have a lot to do with the heavy haulage industry in Queensland. I actually ran the payment permit system for probably over 20 years in total. That when the NHVR came in, there's a lot of companies that used to be in that space that are no longer in that space. I think so. Whether it's right or not, there's probably a perception in the industry that it's harder to do the wrong thing now, but we're working on it. You'll always get non-compliance, but yeah, basically our compliance efforts is a more target compliance and education rather than doing blitzes.
Do you know what, Kerry, what happens if road managers are not able to provide their consent on time?
There's a couple of options. So one option is if you need time to do a route assessment or something like that, you can actually apply for an extension of time, and that basically stops your clock. But that's got to be agreed to by the regulator. Or at the moment, there's no real teeth if you don't comply. You just end up on the list that goes to the ministers and says these people don't comply, don't perform very well, or aren't meeting the average. So, I think with the review of the heavy vehicle national law, there may be some stricter, or maybe some different circumstances if you don't comply, or don't reply, or choose not to reply.
Who pays for bridge inspections required for specific vehicles? What is the mechanism of recouping costs for staff time?
Okay, there's provision in the law for you to recover the cost of getting assessments done. What you have to do, and we're basically out of the loop, you have to, apart from the administrative side, you tell us that you require a bridge assessment or structural assessment, whatever assessment you need to be done. You can give us and provide some information on the costs, which has to be reasonable costs. We can pass that on to the operator, and it's then up to them to decide whether they're willing to pay that cost or not. If they decide not to, that's basically the end of the case. But if they decide to pay the cost to get the work done, that's actually a financial transaction between yourselves and the operator. We don't get involved in anything like that. So there is a process under the law to allow you to recover reasonable costs for doing assessments, not just structural assessments.
So I'm seeking methodology, formula and a program to determine if to determine the permissible point load, live load of a truck on buried pipes at varying depths. Sort of yeah.
It's probably outside our scope here. We can chase up if you want to, but
Yeah, I think we'll
normally the loading is pretty well spread on buried pipes, as long as they're a reasonable distance under the ground level.
Thanks for that question, Gary. We might look into that further and maybe get in touch with you directly.
We'll see if we can find any information on it. Maybe we get in touch with you and get some more details on what sort of point loads he's looking at.
There's quite a few more questions. Let me just...
That's the idea of the session.
Gazette will be double routes and others be transitioning to NHVR in the future or remain with the state, for example Queensland, to assess new route Gazette requests from road managers.
We will be we'll be mapping the Gazette routes.
Yeah.
We can only Gazette things that are approved by, consented to by the road managers. So TMR as a road manager will tell us what roads they think is suitable for B doubles, and local road managers, if they want their roads approved for B doubles or not approved for B doubles, they come to us as well. So I think that's, I'm not sure if it's the answer. If not, contact us and we'll give the right answer.
Gary, you've asked, does anyone in this forum have this knowledge about the formula? That's in regards to the load. June has responded, load on a pipe, CCPAA site for pipe load software and also Australian standards. I'll just pass these comments on to you, Gary, for your consideration. In approving a permit with risk, as these permits are, who is liable when there is an accident involving a permitted vehicle?
As with all things, if you've taken there's a reasonable steps defence. So as long as you've taken all the reasonable steps and you've acted within your authority or your knowledge or whatever else you're using, or you've used a set of guidelines, the reasonable steps says if you've done anything in your power, but time and unforeseen circumstances can affect anyone. So if you haven't done something that's blatantly wrong, that has caused the issue, there's just nothing to wrong. It's not a concern. So,
must all applications for permits go through the NHVR, or can council give a permit for their local road to local residents?
There's no power for councils to give exemptions to heavy vehicles. If they're a complying vehicle and you want to give them an exemption to maybe go into a restricted length street or something like that, or where you've got some signs, or cross a structure that's restricted. So it's a normal tip truck running around with regulation masses. If you've got a 10-tonne limit on a bridge to a farm or something like that, you can actually give an exemption against the signed limit, but you're not giving an exemption against the National Heavy Vehicle Law because it's a compliant vehicle. I know we've had the cases with milk trucks and that not being able to access properties because of signposted limits on bridges. So in that case, the council, under its own powers and its own that it has, can then give an exemption from that, but they can't give an exemption to a restricted access vehicle.
How would a road manager progress an individual consent request to a pre-approval or notice if considered warranted?
We've actually got a form for that as well. So we've got a pre-approval form, and you can tick a box on that, say we can gazette it, or you can just ask us to gazette it.
Yeah, so I think if you're if it's through a permit application and you're assessing a route for the vehicle and you want to pre-approve it, I think there are options there
In the portal.
in the portal.
Yeah.
We also have a manual form. And I think, yeah, if it's just a notice and you want to jump onto the Gazetted network, it is the same form. I believe so. Yeah.
But I think there is an option in the portal when you do your consent to consent for pre-approval, or at least for Gazette, if not pre-approval. We don't use the portal very much.
Yeah. So one question here, as compliance is transitioning to the NHVR, does this include route compliance? Who should we be currently referring public route compliance matters to for consideration and enforcement in Queensland?
You can either go direct. You should, because the compliance office in Queensland work for the NHVR, you can go through our compliance area and they can forward it on to TMR for the enforcement side of things. So it comes to us, and that helps us with our knowledge and our proactive enforcement and everything, the intelligence of what's going on, so we can actually, as far as I understand, our compliance area here can actually direct TMR to undertake compliance activities if they deem it's necessary.
Thanks, Kerry. What is the best email contact for NHVR for road managers? I believe it's RM inquiries.
RM inquiries, yeah.
RM being road manager .inquiries. I'll add that to the slide as well. What is the difference between a gazettal and a notice?
Same thing. It's just it's a notice that's gazetted in the National Gazette, in the Australian Government Gazette. So it's a gazettal notice. So it's terminology.
I think we might use consistent.
We should use notice because the heavy vehicle national law talks about notices and permits. Yeah, but it says the permit, the notices have to be published in the Government Gazette. So that's how they become gazettals or gazette notices.
Back to the first one, where does the responsibility start and stop for the road manager in relation to assessing permits?
Yeah, the law says you've got to look at what does it says? You've got to look at whether the movement or the proposed movement is likely to cause damage to road, will or is likely to cause damage to road infrastructure, impose adverse impacts on the community, so public amenity, or it has significant risk to public safeties, and then look at whether you can use conditions to mitigate, to avoid or significantly minimise that risk. So if it's your road, responsibility, and then it comes back down to have you enough information to enable you to make a reasonable decision. So we'll get on to that later when we look at vehicle and route assessments and structural assessments, because a lot of it's comparing the risks of what's already on using the road against what's proposing to use it. Exposure, so a one-off movement of a oversized, overmass vehicle will have a different risk exposure than a new mine's opened up and you're going to get hundreds of vehicles a day on it. So it's meant to consideration, but the responsibility is that you have a look at how it's going to impact your roads and your community, and can it be conditioned so that it's reasonable. So that's about as best I can say it without going further into it.
There's just a comment here. Another issue is Defence Force vehicles wider than 2.5 metres and are travelling on local roads for driver training purposes.
They should be covered. There's a thing called a Defence Force Road Transport Exemption Notice, or it's actually a law or regulations that they've got, which allows them, and that again was negotiated through the jurisdiction, so that's been long standing.
Yep.
But if there's any new additions to that, they all come through the they should be getting road managers consent. Now, there is a thing with those, while they're over 2.5 wide, they've got exemptions under that transport exemption framework to exempt them from things like signs and flags and things like that. So
I think I'll find that and send it on.
Yeah.
On to you, Bruce. Thanks for the question. All right, any more questions? Let me just quickly go through what we have. Look, I think we might end it there, Kerry.
yeah, that's okay.
If I've missed anyone, please just contact us directly. I'll be reviewing the whole log of comments and questions here to see if I've missed any. I'll probably just email it or call you directly. I think overall, thanks for attending. And if there's any feedback about these sessions, I know this is just the first one of 9. There were some comments before about the room sound, as in some people could hear the meeting next to us. I think we'll take that into consideration for next time. Might get a different room. I think when we sent out the original time for this session, it was Brisbane time. I'll make that clear in our next invitation. And for each upcoming session, it'll be a separate Eventbrite invitation. So you'll probably receive the next one later this week, or early next week. Again, I'll circulate all the slides and all the additional information, such as all the general access stuff, and vehicle sign information, copies of the ministerial guidelines, PBS stuff. And if I do miss anything, please just let us know. Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thank you very much for all that. And yeah, as we said, this is part of our information gathering, so we can help you, so we can provide more training in the future. So,
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.